The stagecoach wheels kicked up dust that spiraled into the azure, Wyoming sky as Bethany Miller clutched her worn leather satchel to her chest, her heart pounding with equal parts hope and dread. It was 1876, and she was heading to Whispering Pines to marry a man she'd never met, a fate that seemed marginally better than the life she was leaving behind. The letter in her pocket promised security, but Bethany knew better than to expect happiness. Happiness wasn't for women who couldn't speak. "Almost there, miss," the driver called back. "You'll be Mrs. Peterson by sundown tomorrow." Bethany nodded, though the driver couldn't see her. Her fingers traced the scar along her throat, the remnant of the childhood fever that had stolen her voice 15 years ago. She'd learned to communicate through written notes and gestures, but most people found her silence unnerving, unsettling. Her parents had arranged this marriage as a last resort after years of failed courtships. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of Whispering Pines' only hotel, a 2-story wooden structure with peeling paint and a creaking sign. Bethany gathered her skirts and stepped down, immediately drawing curious stares from townsfolk loitering on the boardwalk. "That must be Peterson's mail-order bride," whispered a woman in a faded calico dress. "Don't envy him," replied her companion. "Heard she's mute as a fence post." Bethany kept her eyes down, pretending not to notice their scrutiny. She'd grown accustomed to being discussed as though she weren't present. The hotel owner, a portly man with a greasy mustache, frowned when she approached the counter and handed him a note explaining who she was. "Peterson paid for your room until the wedding," he said, sliding a key across the counter. "He's finishing business in Cheyenne, back tomorrow." His eyes raked over her with undisguised curiosity. "That true? You can't talk at all?" Bethany shook her head, taking the key with trembling fingers. "Well, ain't that something?" he muttered. "Room 4, top of the stairs." She was halfway up the staircase when the front doors swung open and a tall figure strode in, spurs jingling against wooden floorboards. The lobby fell silent. "Vaughn," the hotel owner called out. "Thought you were heading to Silver Creek tomorrow." "Changed my plans, Higgins," came the reply, a deep voice that carried authority without raising in volume. "Need a room for the night." Bethany paused, turning slightly to glimpse the newcomer. He stood over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered in a dust-covered duster. His dark hair was too long to be fashionable, and a well-trimmed beard framed his face. When he removed his hat, she noticed his eyes sharp and observant, the color of weathered sage. Vaughn Northcott was the most respected rancher in the Wyoming Territory, though few knew his origins. He'd appeared 7 years ago, bought struggling land, and transformed it into one of the most prosperous cattle operations for 100 miles. He kept to himself, made fair deals, and helped neighbors when drought or bandits threatened. People respected him, but few claimed to know him. Their eyes met briefly across the lobby, and Bethany quickly looked away, continuing up the stairs. She didn't notice how his gaze lingered on her retreating figure, or how he frowned slightly when the hotel owner leaned in to whisper something that made the other men chuckle. Bethany's room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and wash basin. She unpacked her meager belongings, smoothing out her wedding dress, a simple blue affair that had belonged to her cousin. Tomorrow she would meet Mr. Peterson, a widower who owned the general store and needed a wife to help with the business and his 2 young children. The arrangement was practical. Love wasn't part of the equation. She opened the window to catch the evening breeze and heard laughter from below. A group of women had gathered outside the millinery shop across the street, and their voices carried clearly. Peterson's bride arrived today. The mute one, Lord have mercy. What kind of wife can't even speak to her husband or his children, poor little ones? Maybe she can cook at least. Peterson needs someone to mind those wild children. I give it 6 months before he ships her back east. Bethany shut the window with more force than intended, her cheeks burning with humiliation. These were to be her neighbors, the women she would see at church and in the mercantile. Already they had judged her, found her wanting. She sat heavily on the bed, fighting back tears. Perhaps this had been a mistake. Perhaps she should return east on tomorrow's stagecoach. But what waited for her there? Her parents' disappointment. The charitable positions offered out of pity. A knock at her door startled her. She wiped her eyes hastily and opened it to find a young girl of perhaps 12, holding a tray. "Evening meal, miss," the girl said, eyeing Bethany with undisguised curiosity. "Pa said to bring it up since you might not want to eat in the dining room." Bethany smiled gratefully and took the tray, then reached into her pocket for a coin. "No need," the girl said, still lingering in the doorway. "Is it true you can't talk at all, not even a whisper?" Bethany shook her head. "Don't you get lonely, not talking to anybody?" The question, asked with a child's innocent directness, struck Bethany to her core. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I'm Lily," the girl continued. "If you want company while you eat, I could stay. I don't mind if you don't talk back." Bethany's smile widened and she gestured for Lily to enter. As they shared the meal, Lily chattered about the town, its inhabitants, and the upcoming Founders' Day celebration. Bethany listened, nodding and smiling, enjoying the first friendly interaction she'd had since arriving. "Mr. Peterson's nice enough," Lily said eventually, watching Bethany's reaction. "His children are terrors, though. The boy bit me once when I was minding them." She touched a small scar on her arm. "Mrs. Peterson, the first when she was from back east too, died of fever last winter." "Mr. Peterson, he gets angry sometimes, especially when he drinks. But most men do, my pa says." Bethany's appetite diminished at this description of her future husband. She had few illusions about marriage, but she'd hoped for basic kindness at least. "I should go," Lily said, gathering the dishes. "Pa will wonder where I am, but I'll see you tomorrow, miss." After Lily left, Bethany prepared for bed, her mind troubled. Sleep evaded her as she listened to the sounds of the town settling for the night, piano music from the saloon down the street, occasional laughter, the distant howl of a coyote. This was to be her home, these people her community. She would need to find a way to belong. Morning came too quickly. Bethany dressed carefully in her best traveling dress, arranged her honey brown hair in a simple style, and practiced her smile in the small mirror. Today she would meet the man she was to marry. She had just finished her breakfast when Lily burst into her room, breathless and wide-eyed. "Miss." "There's a commotion downstairs. Mr. Peterson arrived, but he's in a state. Seems his store was robbed last night. He's saying he can't take a wife now with his business in trouble." Bethany felt the floor tilt beneath her. She gripped the bedpost for support. No marriage, no home, no future. She followed Lily downstairs, where a red-faced man was gesturing wildly, his voice raised in agitation. "Can't afford it now. Send her back. I'll lose half my inventory." The hotel owner looked uncomfortable. "Peterson, you can't just—" "I can and I will. What use is a mute woman to me now?" "I need money, not another mouth to feed." Bethany stepped into the lobby and conversation halted. Peterson, a man of perhaps 40 with thinning hair and a substantial paunch, looked her up and down with undisguised disappointment. "This her? She's plainer than her photograph." He turned back to the hotel owner. "Put her on the next stage east. I'll pay the fare, but that's all." Bethany's cheeks flamed with mortification as every eye in the lobby fixed on her. She fumbled in her reticule for her notepad and pencil, but her hands shook too badly to write. "That's enough, Peterson." The voice came from the corner of the room where Vaughn Northcott had been observing the scene. He stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention. "The lady came 2,000 miles to marry you. You made a commitment." Peterson scoffed. "What do you know about it, Northcott? Mind your own affairs. I need a wife who can help in the store, talk to customers." "What good is she?" "She has ears to hear and hands to work, same as anyone," Vaughn replied evenly. "And she's standing right here, listening to you talk about her like she's livestock at auction." Several onlookers shifted uncomfortably. Bethany stared at the tall rancher, astonished by his intervention. "My store was robbed," Peterson spluttered. "I'm ruined." "You're insured through Wells Fargo. I heard you boasting about it last month," Vaughn countered. "This is about something else." Peterson's face darkened. "Fine, you want the truth. I've been courting Widow Jenkins these 3 months. She agreed to marry me last night. Comes with her own money and can speak just fine." A shocked murmur ran through the crowd. Bethany felt as though she might faint from humiliation. "So you arranged for a bride, then changed your mind when something better came along," Vaughn said, his voice dangerously quiet. "That's not how we do business out here, Peterson." "What would you have me do? Marry them both?" Peterson laughed at his own joke, but no one joined him. Vaughn studied the storekeeper for a long moment, then turned to Bethany. His eyes were kind as they met hers. "Miss Miller, I apologize for this town's poor welcome." He removed his hat in a gesture of respect. "If you'll permit me to make an alternative proposal." The room fell silent, every person straining to hear what would come next. "My ranch needs a housekeeper. The position comes with private quarters, fair wages, and my word that you'll be treated with respect. If that arrangement suits you until you decide your next step, the job is yours." Bethany blinked in surprise, her mind racing. It wasn't marriage, but it was respectable employment and a roof over her head. She nodded slowly. "Excellent." Vaughn turned back to Peterson. "You'll refund her travel expenses in full. Now." Peterson opened his mouth to protest, but something in Vaughn's expression made him reconsider. Grumbling, he counted out bills and thrust them at Bethany, who took them with trembling fingers. "My wagon's outside," Vaughn said to her. "When you're ready to depart, I'll be waiting." An hour later, Bethany sat beside Vaughn on the wagon seat, her small trunk secured in the back. The town of Whispering Pines grew smaller behind them as they traveled west along a well-worn trail. "North Star Ranch is about 10 miles out," Vaughn explained. "Good water, good grazing land. The house isn't fancy, but it's solid. My foreman and 4 ranch hands live in the bunkhouse. Mrs. Kavanaugh comes 3 days a week to cook, but she's getting on in years and can't manage the cleaning and laundry anymore." Bethany nodded, writing on her notepad, "Thank you for your kindness. I'm a hard worker." Vaughn glanced at her note and smiled slightly. "I believe you are, Miss Miller, and it wasn't kindness, just decency. Peterson had no right to treat you that way." She wrote again, "Why help me?" He considered her question for several minutes before answering. "I've seen how people treat those they consider different. It isn't right." He paused, then added more softly, "And I know what it's like to be judged before you've had a chance to prove yourself." Something in his tone suggested personal experience, but Bethany didn't press. Instead, she watched the landscape unfold before them, rolling prairie dotted with sagebrush, distant blue mountains, and an endless sky that seemed to touch the earth at the horizon. It was beautiful in its vastness, so different from the crowded eastern city where she'd grown up. As they crested a hill, Vaughn pointed ahead. North Star. The ranch spread across a sheltered valley, a collection of well-maintained buildings centered around a 2-story house built of sturdy logs. A large barn stood nearby, with corrals and smaller outbuildings arranged in practical formation. Cattle grazed in the distance and horses moved in a fenced pasture. "It's not much compared to Eastern standards," Vaughn said, a hint of pride in his voice, "but it's mine, built most of it with my own hands." Bethany wrote quickly, "It's beautiful." His eyes warmed at her response. "Thank you." "It's been a labor of love." As they approached, a weathered man with graying hair emerged from the barn, lifting a hand in greeting. "That's Hank Morrison, my foreman," Vaughn explained. "Been with me since I bought this place. Good man." Hank waited as they pulled up, his curious gaze taking in Bethany. "Hank, this is Miss Bethany Miller. She'll be taking over as housekeeper. Miss Miller, Hank Morrison." "Madam," Hank said with a respectful nod. "Welcome to North Star." Bethany smiled and nodded in return. "Miss Miller doesn't speak," Vaughn explained, "but she communicates well enough with writing and gestures." If Hank was surprised, he didn't show it. "Reckon actions speak louder than words most times anyway." He turned to Vaughn. "Everything's quiet. Boys are out checking the south pasture fence line. Mrs. Kavanaugh left a stew for supper." "Good. I'll show Miss Miller to her quarters, then join you." Vaughn helped Bethany down from the wagon and carried her trunk to the house. Inside, the main floor consisted of a spacious great room with a massive stone fireplace, a dining area with a long table that could seat at least 10, and a well-equipped kitchen. Everything was clean and orderly, though plainly furnished. "The hands don't come in the main house except for Sunday dinner," Vaughn explained. "My office is there." He pointed to a closed door. "Upstairs are my quarters and 2 guest rooms. Your rooms are through here." He led her to a door off the kitchen that opened to reveal a small sitting room with its own fireplace, connected to a bedroom with a comfortable-looking bed, dresser, and washstand. A window overlooked a kitchen garden and the hills beyond. The previous housekeeper was my aunt. She lived here until she passed 2 years ago, Vaughn said. I hope you'll find it comfortable. There's a bell if you need assistance and the door has a lock. Bethany wrote, It's lovely. When shall I begin my duties? Tomorrow is soon enough. Rest today. Get settled. Mrs. Kavanaugh will show you the routines when she comes tomorrow. After Vaughn left, Bethany unpacked her belongings, hanging her dresses in the small wardrobe and placing her few personal items on the dresser. The wedding dress she folded carefully and stored at the bottom of the trunk. She wouldn't need it now. She sat on the bed, allowing herself a moment of reflection. In less than a day, her life had completely changed course. Instead of becoming Mrs. Peterson, mistress of a general store, she was now housekeeper at a cattle ranch miles from town. It wasn't the future she'd imagined, but perhaps it was a better one. At least Mr. Northcott had shown her basic respect, something rare enough in her experience. The next weeks fell into a rhythm. Bethany learned the household routines from Mrs. Kavanaugh, a plump, cheerful widow who treated her with friendly efficiency. The house wasn't difficult to maintain, though it required constant attention to keep dust and mud at bay. She prepared breakfast and supper on the days Mrs. Kavanaugh wasn't there, mended linens and clothing, and kept the main house spotless. The ranch hands were respectful, if distant. They didn't quite know how to interact with her, but they removed their hats when they saw her and thanked her for the meals. Hank was more forthcoming, occasionally stopping to inquire if she needed anything from town. Vaughn himself was often absent, riding out at dawn and returning after dark. When their paths crossed, he was unfailingly polite but reserved. He thanked her for meals, complimented improvements she made to the house, and asked if she had everything she needed but rarely engaged in longer communication. Yet Bethany found herself watching for him, noticing the way his expression softened when he returned home, how he always wiped his boots meticulously before entering, the gentle way he treated his horses. He was a man of few words himself, speaking only when necessary, which made her feel less self-conscious about her own silence. A month into her employment, Bethany was gathering eggs in the chicken coop when she heard raised voices from the corral. Curious, she peered around the corner to see Vaughn and Hank confronting 3 men on horseback. You've got no claim here, Blackwell, Vaughn was saying, his stance tense. The water rights were settled last year. The lead rider, a flashy man with an elaborate mustache, sneered. The territorial judge might see things differently now that I've acquired the Porter place. My cattle need that water. There's plenty upstream on your property, Hank interjected. You're just looking to cause trouble. Watch your mouth, old man, one of Blackwell's companions growled, his hand hovering near his gun. Bethany inhaled sharply, drawing attention to her presence. 5 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Well, what have we here? Blackwell's tone turned mocking as he took in her simple dress and work apron. Northcott, you've been holding out. Didn't know you had a woman. Miss Miller is my housekeeper, Vaughn said coldly, and none of your concern. Blackwell studied Bethany with interest. A pretty one, too. Does she talk, or just warm your bed? Before Vaughn could respond, Bethany marched forward, her basket of eggs still in hand. She stopped directly in front of Blackwell's horse and fixed him with a glare that would have withered spring flowers. Miss Miller doesn't speak, Vaughn said, moving to stand beside her. But she doesn't need words to make her feelings clear, Blackwell laughed. A mute housekeeper, how convenient, he leaned down from his saddle. What's wrong, darling? Cat got your tongue. Bethany's response was swift and decisive. She selected an egg from her basket and smashed it against Blackwell's expensive leather boot. There was a moment of stunned silence before Hank burst into laughter. Even Blackwell's companions poorly concealed their amusement. You little, Blackwell started, his face contorting with rage. I choose your next words carefully, Vaughn interrupted, his hand now resting openly on his pistol. Very carefully. Blackwell glared at them both, then yanked his horse's reins. This isn't over, Northcott, not by a long shot. He spurred his mount and galloped away, his men following. When they were out of sight, Vaughn turned to Bethany, his expression hovering between concern and amusement. That was either very brave or very foolish, Miss Miller. Bethany shrugged, a small smile playing at her lips as she wrote. He deserved worse than an egg. Vaughn read her note and laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his face. That he did. But Blackwell is a dangerous enemy. He's been trying to push smaller ranchers out since he arrived last year. Man's a snake, Hank added, but he's got money and connections in Cheyenne. Bethany's expression grew concerned as she wrote, "Will there be trouble?" "There already is," Vaughn sighed, "but nothing for you to worry about, though perhaps you should stay closer to the house for a while." That evening, to her surprise, Vaughn lingered after supper. Usually, he retired to his office to work on ranch accounts, but tonight he remained at the table, nursing a cup of coffee as Bethany cleared the dishes. "Would you join me?" he asked when she finished. "There's something I'd like to discuss." Bethany sat across from him, curious. "I realize I know very little about you," Vaughn began. "Your circumstances, your background, it wasn't my place to ask when you first arrived, but now—" He hesitated. "I find myself wanting to know more." Bethany considered his request, then reached for her notepad. Over the next hour, she shared her story in brief written passages. She told him about the fever that had damaged her vocal cords at age 8, her education at a special school for afflicted children, her parents' increasing desperation to see her settled as she entered adulthood, how the arrangement with Peterson had seemed her only option for independence. Vaughn read each note carefully, occasionally asking questions but mostly listening in the way few people ever had, with genuine interest rather than pity or discomfort. "And what would you want?" he asked finally. "If you could choose any future for yourself." The question startled her. No one had ever asked what she wanted. She thought for several minutes before writing, "A home of my own, work that matters, people who see me, not just my silence." Vaughn nodded slowly. "Simple things that should be everyone's right." He hesitated, then added, "I lost my ability to hear in my left ear after a mining accident when I was 20. It's not the same as your situation, but I understand something of being judged for what people perceive as lacking." Bethany's eyes widened in surprise. She'd never noticed any indication he had trouble hearing. "I've learned to compensate," he explained, seeing her reaction. "I read lips well, and I position myself to keep people on my right side. Most never realize." She wrote, "Why tell me?" "Because I trust you," he said simply. "And because I want you to know that I understand, at least in some small way, what it means to adapt to a world that expects certain capabilities." Their conversation shifted to lighter topics after that books they'd enjoyed. They shared a fondness for Dickens. Places they'd seen, his experiences far outstripped hers, and their favorite seasons both preferred autumn. When the clock struck 10, Vaughn rose reluctantly. "I've kept you too late. Thank you for the conversation, Miss Miller." Bethany wrote. "Bethany, please," he smiled. "Bethany, and I'm Vaughn, at least when we're not in company." That night marked a change in their relationship. Vaughn began joining her for supper regularly, not just eating but conversing. He brought her books from his personal library and asked her opinion on ranch matters. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence in the great room, she with her mending, he with ranch ledgers. Spring blossomed into summer, bringing longer days and increased activity on the ranch. Bethany expanded the kitchen garden, adding flowers among the vegetables. She took to leaving wildflower arrangements on Vaughn's desk, a gesture he acknowledged with quiet appreciation. The conflict with Blackwell simmered in the background. Twice, North Star cattle were found dead near the property line. Once, a section of fence was cut. Vaughn never discussed these incidents with Bethany, but she heard enough from Hank and Mrs. Kavanaugh to understand the situation was worsening. In late July, Bethany accompanied Mrs. Kavanaugh to town for supplies. It was her first visit to Whispering Pines since her arrival at North Star, and she was apprehensive about the reception she might receive. Her fears proved justified. As they loaded purchases into the wagon, a group of women gathered nearby, their voices deliberately loud. "There's Peterson's reject," one said. "Living out at Northcott's place now? Shameful," another agreed. "A single woman with all those men, no proper chaperone. Mrs. Kavanaugh doesn't count, she's only there 3 days a week. My Henry says she's more than a housekeeper, if you take my meaning." Mrs. Kavanaugh bristled. Ignore them, dearie, small minds and smaller hearts. But the words stung. Bethany had believed she'd found a respectable position, one that allowed her dignity. Now she realized that perception might not be shared by the community. The ride back to the ranch was subdued. When they arrived, Bethany went straight to her room, fighting tears. She'd been foolish to think she could escape judgment. Even here, a knock at her door roused her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Vaughn, his expression concerned. Mrs. Kavanaugh mentioned there was trouble in town, he said. May I come in? Bethany hesitated. Allowing him into her private quarters would only fuel gossip if known, but then nodded. They sat in her small sitting room, the door left purposely ajar. Vaughn listened as she explained what had happened, his jaw tightening with each written word. I'm sorry, he said when she finished. People can be cruel without cause. He paused. Does it concern you what they think? Bethany wrote carefully, not for myself, but I worry it reflects poorly on you and Northstar. Let me worry about Northstar's reputation, Vaughn replied firmly, but if you're uncomfortable with the arrangement, we could consider alternatives. Her heart sank at the thought of leaving. She shook her head vehemently. Good, he said, visibly relieved, because I've grown accustomed to your presence here. He stood, suddenly seeming uncertain. In fact, I've come to look forward to our evenings together more than I can express. Before Bethany could respond, hoofbeats sounded in the yard, followed by shouting. Vaughn moved quickly to the window. It's Hank, he said, already heading for the door. Something's wrong. Bethany followed him outside, where Hank was dismounting from a lathered horse. Fire in the south pasture, the foreman reported grimly. It's moving fast toward the winter hay we cut last week. Boys are trying to contain it, but we need more hands. Deliberate? Vaughn asked. Hank nodded. Found coal oil cans, Blackwell's work, I'd bet my life on it. Vaughn swore under his breath. Gather whatever men are here, I'll get my gear. He turned to Bethany. Stay close to the house. If the wind shifts, the fire could head this way. For the next several hours, Bethany paced anxiously, watching the distant smoke plume grow. Mrs. Kavanaugh prepared food and filled canteens for the firefighters, while Bethany gathered blankets and medical supplies in case of injuries. It was well after midnight when the men returned, exhausted and smoke-blackened but successful. The fire had been contained before reaching the hay stores, though a significant portion of grazing land was destroyed. Bethany and Mrs. Kavanaugh served food as the men reported to Vaughn. 2 ranch hands had suffered minor burns, which Bethany treated with salve and bandages. It was deliberate, all right, one hand said. Found tracks leading back toward Blackwell's property. We need proof, Vaughn replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. The territorial marshal won't act on suspicion alone. Blackwell's getting desperate, Hank observed. The droughts hit his overcrowded range hard. He needs our water more than ever, or he's trying to force us to sell, Vaughn added. Either way, we'll need to post guards until this is resolved. When the men had eaten and retired to the bunkhouse, Bethany insisted on examining Vaughn's hands, which he'd been carefully keeping out of sight. As she suspected, they were blistered and raw from fighting the fire. She gave him a reproachful look as she gently cleaned and bandaged them. It's nothing, he insisted. I've had worse. Bethany shook her head, writing, You should have told me sooner. There were others who needed attention first. He watched her work, his expression softening. You have gentle hands. She finished the bandaging and wrote, You should rest. It's been a long night. I doubt I could sleep, he admitted. Too much on my mind. They moved to the great room where Bethany built up the fire against the night chill. Vaughn sank into his armchair, the strain of the evening visible in the lines of his face. 7 years building this place, he said quietly. 7 years of backbreaking work, careful planning, sacrifices, and Blackwell thinks he can take it with a few threats and a match. Bethany sat across from him, writing, He won't succeed. No, he won't, Vaughn's voice hardened. I won't let him. He looked at her, his expression suddenly vulnerable. I built Northstar to be more than just a successful ranch. I wanted it to be a home, a legacy. On impulse, Bethany reached across and took his bandaged hand in hers. Their eyes met, and something shifted in the air between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing for months. Vaughn gently squeezed her fingers. Bethany, A shout from outside interrupted whatever he'd been about to say. They both rushed to the window to see one of the ranch hands pointing toward the horizon where a new fire blazed. "The north pasture," Vaughn said grimly. "He's not giving up." The next days brought little rest. Blackwell's men started 3 more fires, though all were caught before causing major damage. The ranch hands began patrolling in shifts, weapons ready. Tension hung over North Star like the smoke that periodically drifted across the property. Bethany threw herself into supporting the ranch's defense, preparing meals at all hours, mending clothes torn during firefighting, and keeping watch while others rested. She and Vaughn had little opportunity for private conversation, though the memory of that interrupted moment by the fire remained vivid in her mind. A week after the first fire, Hank burst into the kitchen where Bethany was preparing supper. "Ryder's coming," he announced. "Looks like the marshal from Cheyenne," and his face darkened. "Blackwell." Bethany dried her hands and followed him outside, where Vaughn already stood waiting, his expression guarded. 6 riders approached a distinguished man wearing a marshal's badge, Blackwell, and 4 others she didn't recognize. "Northcott," the marshal called as they dismounted. "Been hearing troubling reports, thought I'd see for myself." "Marshal Davis," Vaughn greeted him coolly. "What brings you so far from Cheyenne?" "Allegations of water rights violations," Davis replied. "Mr. Blackwell here has filed a formal complaint." Blackwell stepped forward, a triumphant smile playing on his lips. "The law's finally catching up to you, Northcott." "What violations?" Vaughn demanded. "We've adhered to every ruling on water access." "That's not how my witnesses remember it," Blackwell said smoothly, gesturing to the men accompanying him. "These gentlemen will testify that you've been damming Cottonwood Creek illegally." "That's a lie," Hank growled. "There's no dam on that creek. We'll inspect the waterway ourselves," the marshal said. "If there's no dam, there's no violation." "By all means," Vaughn agreed. "But why bring armed men for an inspection?" Marshal Davis looked uncomfortable. "Standard procedure for a disputed claim." "Or preparation for something else," Vaughn suggested, his hand resting near his sidearm. Tension crackled between the groups. Bethany moved closer to Vaughn, her presence a silent statement of support. Blackwell noticed, his eyes narrowing. "Still keeping company with the mute, Northcott." "Does she do more than clean your house?" Vaughn stiffened. "You're on my property, Blackwell, mind your tongue." "Just curious what hold she has on you," Blackwell continued, his tone deliberately goading. "Must be something special given her limitations." "That's enough," the marshal interrupted, looking embarrassed. "This isn't relevant to our purpose." But Blackwell wasn't finished. He turned his attention to Bethany, his expression contemptuous. "What's wrong, girl? Nothing to say for yourself. Or is it true what they say in town that you spread your legs for any man who'll put a roof over your head?" Several things happened at once. Vaughn lunged forward, only to be restrained by Hank. The marshal shouted for order. And Bethany, her face burning with humiliation, did something she hadn't done in 15 years. She tried to speak. No coherent sound emerged, only a strangled cry that tore painfully from her damaged throat. The effort left her gasping, tears springing to her eyes from both pain and frustration. Vaughn broke free of Hank's grip, his face terrible with rage. "Get off my land," he said to Blackwell, his voice dangerously quiet. "Now, before I forget the law entirely." "You're threatening me in front of a federal marshal," Blackwell laughed. "Not smart, Northcott." The marshal stepped between them. "Both of you stand down. We came to inspect a water dispute, nothing more." He turned to Blackwell. "Your personal comments were out of line. Apologize to the lady. Apologize to a mute who can't even acknowledge it." Blackwell scoffed. "I think not." "Then leave," the marshal ordered. "My deputies and I will conduct the inspection alone. I'll not have this devolve further." Blackwell hesitated, clearly unhappy with this turn of events, but eventually remounted his horse. "This isn't over, Northcott, not by a long shot." He rode away, his posture rigid with anger. The marshal sighed heavily. "I apologize for that display, miss. Blackwell's influence in the territorial capital has been problematic for many." Bethany nodded acknowledgement, still shaken by the confrontation and her own reaction. Her throat ached from the attempt to speak. Let's get this inspection done, Vaughn said curtly. Hank, show the marshal and his men to Cottonwood Creek. I'll join you shortly. As the others departed, Vaughn turned to Bethany, his anger replaced by concern. Are you all right? She nodded, though her hands trembled as she wrote, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have reacted. Don't apologize, Vaughn said fiercely. Blackwell is the one who should be sorry, and he will be. Please don't do anything rash, she wrote. It's what he wants to provoke you into action that will cost you Northstar. Vaughn's expression softened as he read her words. When did you become the voice of reason between us? Despite everything, Bethany smiled at the irony of his statement. She wrote, someone has to be. He touched her cheek gently. I need to join the inspection. Will you be all right? She nodded, and he reluctantly departed. Bethany returned to the kitchen but found herself too unsettled to continue cooking. Instead, she sat at the table, trying to calm her racing thoughts. The marshal's inspection found no dam or water rights violations, as Vaughn had known it would. After examining the creek and consulting maps of property boundaries, Davis apologized for the inconvenience and promised to dismiss Blackwell's complaint. Between us, he told Vaughn as they stood by the marshal's horse, Blackwell's making enemies throughout the territory. His methods are drawing attention in Cheyenne, not the good kind, but he has powerful friends, so tread carefully. I always do, Vaughn replied. But I won't be driven off my land, the marshal nodded. Fair enough, just keep it legal, Northcott. I'd hate to come back under different circumstances. After the marshal departed, Vaughn called the ranch hands together. Double the night patrols, he instructed. Blackwell won't take this defeat lightly. That evening, Bethany was surprised when Vaughn knocked on her door well after supper. She'd retired early, emotionally drained from the day's events. I'm sorry to disturb you, he said when she opened the door, but there's something I need to say, and it won't wait until morning. She invited him in, curious and a little apprehensive. He declined to sit, instead pacing her small sitting room with nervous energy. Today, when Blackwell spoke to you that way, I wanted to kill him, Vaughn began bluntly, not figuratively, actually end his life. He ran a hand through his hair. That reaction, it frightened me, not because I'm unaccustomed to anger, but because of its intensity, because it was for you. Bethany watched him, her heart beginning to race. These past months, you've become essential to Northstar, he continued. To its functioning, yes, but more than that, to its spirit, to what makes it a home rather than just a property. He stopped pacing and faced her directly. You've become essential to me, she remained frozen, afraid to believe what his words seemed to be suggesting. I didn't plan this, Vaughn admitted. When I offered you employment, it was out of basic decency, nothing more. I didn't expect to find myself looking forward to every moment in your company. I didn't expect to learn to read your expressions so well I sometimes forget you don't speak aloud. I didn't expect. He took a deep breath. To fall in love with you, Bethany's eyes widened. She fumbled for her notepad, but Vaughn gently took it from her hands. You don't need to write your response, he said softly. Your eyes speak clearly enough, but I need you to understand what I'm offering. Not employment, not protection, but partnership. Marriage if you'll have me. He knelt before her chair, taking her trembling hands in his. I love you, Bethany Miller. Your silence has never hindered my understanding of you. In fact, I think I hear you more clearly than I've ever heard anyone. Will you be my wife? Tears filled Bethany's eyes as she nodded emphatically, her hands squeezing his in wordless affirmation. Vaughn's face transformed with joy. He rose, pulling her gently to her feet and into his arms. Their first kiss was tender, a promise of understanding deeper than words could express. When they finally parted, Bethany reached for her notepad. I love you too, have for months, Vaughn smiled. I know you speak volumes with your actions, your expressions. I just needed to be sure you wanted this as much as I do. They spent the next hour planning their future, deciding on a small wedding at the ranch within the month. Bethany would continue overseeing the household, but now as its mistress rather than employee. There will be talk, Vaughn warned. The town already gossips about us. Bethany wrote, let them talk. We know the truth. He kissed her again. Yes, we do. The following weeks passed in a blur of preparation and increasing vigilance against potential retribution from Blackwell. The ranch hands received the news of the engagement with approval. They'd witnessed the growing connection between Vaughn and Bethany and understood better than most how they complemented each other. Mrs. Kavanaugh was ecstatic, immediately taking charge of wedding preparations. "I always said you two were perfect for each other," she declared. "About time you realized it yourselves." 3 days before the wedding, Bethany and Mrs. Kavanaugh made a final trip to town for supplies. The general store, now run by Peterson's new wife, the former widow Jenkins, fell silent when they entered. Mrs. Kavanaugh, the new Mrs. Peterson, greeted them coolly. "And Miss Miller, we heard about your arrangement with Mr. Northcott." "Engagement," Mrs. Kavanaugh corrected firmly. "They're to be married Saturday." "How unconventional," Mrs. Peterson replied. "Though I suppose Mr. Northcott has always kept to himself, birds of a feather, as they say." Bethany held her head high, refusing to show how the barbed comments affected her. She made her purchases efficiently, ignoring the whispers that followed them through the store. Outside, they encountered the minister's wife, Mrs. Green, a kindly woman who had never participated in the town gossip. "Miss Miller," she called, approaching with a genuine smile. "I hear congratulations are in order. My husband is looking forward to performing the ceremony." Bethany smiled gratefully, nodding her thanks. "We're honored you asked Reverend Green," Mrs. Green continued, "and don't you mind the talk. Half the women in this town would trade places with you in a heartbeat. Vaughn Northcott is the finest man in the territory, and anyone with eyes can see how he feels about you." The sincere words were balm to Bethany's spirit after the cold reception in the store. As they loaded their purchases, a commotion erupted down the street. Riders were galloping into town, one supporting another who appeared injured. "That's Jim and Luke from North Star," Mrs. Kavanaugh said, alarmed. "Something's wrong." They hurried toward the commotion. The injured ranch hand was being helped down from his horse, blood seeping through his shirt. "Ambushed," he was saying to the gathering crowd. "Blackwell's men, they're heading for North Star, 30 riders at least." Bethany's heart stopped. Vaughn was at the ranch with only Hank and 2 other hands. "Where's the marshal?" someone asked. "Returned to Cheyenne yesterday," came the reply. "The sheriff, out at the Wilson place investigating cattle theft." Bethany grabbed Jim's arm, her expression desperate. He understood immediately. "Vaughn sent us for help when the lookout spotted riders approaching," he explained. "Said to bring back anyone willing to stand against Blackwell." Several men stepped forward, immediately neighboring ranchers who had their own reasons to oppose Blackwell's expanding influence. Others hesitated, weighing personal safety against community responsibility. "Northcott would do the same for any of us," declared an older rancher. "I'm in." "Me too," added another. "Blackwell needs to be stopped before he runs roughshod over the entire territory." Within minutes, 15 men had volunteered. They gathered weapons and ammunition, preparing to ride to North Star's defense. Bethany insisted on accompanying them, ignoring Mrs. Kavanaugh's protests. She would not remain safely in town while Vaughn faced danger. The injured ranch hand provided his horse, and she rode at the front of the group beside Jim, her heart pounding with fear and determination. The 20-mile ride seemed endless. As they crested the final hill overlooking North Star, they saw smoke rising from one of the outbuildings. Gunfire echoed across the valley. "There," Jim pointed. "Blackwell's men have them pinned in the main house." Through her borrowed field glasses, Bethany could see riders circling the ranch house, occasionally firing at the windows. The barn was ablaze and several smaller structures had been damaged. "We need to split up," suggested one of the volunteers. "Hit them from multiple sides." Jim nodded. "Half circle west, half east. We'll drive them toward the creek bed where they'll be exposed." The plan was quickly organized. Bethany was instructed to remain with the eastern group, but stay back from the actual fighting. She agreed, though she had no intention of remaining idle if Vaughn was in danger. The attack began with precision. The volunteers split as planned, using the terrain for cover as they approached. When they were in position, they opened fire simultaneously, catching Blackwell's men by surprise. Confusion erupted among the attackers. Some returned fire, others sought cover, and a few attempted to flee. From the ranch house, Vaughn and his men seized the opportunity to join the counterattack. Bethany watched anxiously from her position behind a rocky outcropping. The battle seemed to be turning in their favor when she spotted Blackwell himself breaking away from the main group, riding hard toward the house. Something in his posture, the determined way he held a rifle, triggered a warning in her mind. Without conscious thought, she spurred her horse forward, cutting across the battlefield toward the house. Gunfire continued around her, but she focused solely on reaching Vaughn, who had emerged onto the porch, exchanging shots with retreating attackers. Blackwell raised his rifle, taking careful aim at Vaughn's unprotected back. Bethany's horse ate up the distance. She was still too far to intervene physically, but not too far to be heard. Drawing on every ounce of strength, she forced sound through her damaged vocal cords, not words, but a raw, primal scream of warning. The sound tore painfully from her throat, but it carried across the yard. Vaughn spun at the noise, instantly recognizing its source and significance. He dove sideways as Blackwell's shot splintered the doorframe where he'd been standing. Hank, positioned at an upstairs window, returned fire. Blackwell jerked in his saddle, then toppled to the ground, his rifle falling harmlessly beside him. The fighting ended quickly after that. With their leader down and reinforcements defending the ranch, Blackwell's men surrendered or fled. Those captured were secured in the bunkhouse to await the sheriff's return. Bethany dismounted near the house, her legs barely supporting her as the danger passed. Her throat burned from the effort of her warning cry, but the pain was insignificant compared to her relief at seeing Vaughn alive. He rushed to her, gathering her into his arms with such force it nearly knocked the breath from her lungs. "I heard you," he whispered fiercely against her hair. "I heard you, Bethany." She clung to him, tears streaming down her face, tears of relief, of pain, of love. When he finally released her enough to see her face, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "You saved my life." His fingers gently touched her throat. "At what cost?" She shook her head, fumbling for her notepad, worth any price. "You shouldn't have come," he admonished, though his arms tightened around her. "It was too dangerous." "I couldn't stay away," she wrote, "not when you were in danger." Their reunion was interrupted by Hank, approaching with news that 3 of Blackwell's men had been killed, including Blackwell himself. Several more were wounded, as was one of the North Star hands, though not seriously. "The sheriff should be here by sundown," Hank reported. "Jim rode to fetch him after we secured the prisoners." "Good," Vaughn nodded. "We'll need statements from everyone about what happened." He kept his arm around Bethany as they walked toward the house. "The wedding may need to be postponed until this is sorted out." Bethany shook her head emphatically, writing, "No postponement. Life is too uncertain." Vaughn smiled, touching her cheek tenderly. "You're right, as usual." The aftermath of the battle kept everyone busy through the night and following day. The sheriff arrived with deputies, taking statements and removing the prisoners. The territorial marshal returned from Cheyenne to oversee the investigation, bringing a physician to tend the wounded. Evidence of Blackwell's illegal activities quickly mounted. Papers found in his saddlebags documented a pattern of intimidation and land theft throughout the territory. Several of his captured men, facing serious charges, provided testimony about his instructions to drive Vaughn off North Star by any means necessary. "You've done the territory a service," Marshal Davis told Vaughn. "Blackwell's operation was more extensive than we realized. His death will bring stability to the region." "I take no pleasure in any man's death," Vaughn replied solemnly. "I only defended what's mine." By the day before the wedding, a semblance of normalcy had returned to North Star. The damaged-out buildings were being repaired, and news of Blackwell's defeat had spread throughout the territory. Unexpectedly, the events had transformed public opinion in Whispering Pines. Many who had previously gossiped about Bethany now praised her courage in riding to Vaughn's defense. "Half the town's coming to the wedding," Mrs. Kavanaugh reported with satisfaction. "Amazing how a little gunfire changes people's perspectives." The ceremony took place in North Star's front yard on a perfect late summer day. Wildflowers decorated the simple arch constructed by the ranch hands, and benches borrowed from the town church accommodated the surprising number of guests. Bethany wore a new dress of ivory silk, ordered from Denver weeks earlier. As she walked toward Vaughn, who waited beside Reverend Green under the flower-draped arch, she felt none of the nervousness she'd expected. This was right. This was home. Vaughn watched her approach, his expression one of undisguised awe and love. When she reached him, he took her hands in his, squeezing gently in reassurance. Reverend Green conducted the ceremony with sensitivity to Bethany's unique circumstances. When it came time for the vows, Vaughn spoke his aloud while Bethany presented written vows, which the Reverend read for the assembly. I, Bethany, take you, Vaughn, as my husband. Though I cannot speak my love aloud, I will show it in every action, every day. You heard me when others only noticed my silence. You saw strength where others saw limitation. With you, I am whole, I am heard, I am home. There wasn't a dry eye in the gathering as Vaughn responded. I, Vaughn, take you, Bethany, as my wife. Your silence taught me to listen with more than my ears. Your courage showed me the true meaning of strength. When the world mocked what it didn't understand, I recognized the rarest of treasures. I hear you louder than the world, and I will cherish your unspoken words all the days of our lives. They exchanged rings, simple gold bands that symbolized a bond far more complex and precious than metal could represent. By the authority vested in me, Reverend Green concluded, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Vaughn gently lifted Bethany's face to his eyes conveying everything words could not. Their kiss was a promise, sealed before witnesses but meant only for each other. The celebration continued well into the evening. Neighbors who had once whispered behind Bethany's back now approached with congratulations and invitations to social events. The transformation was remarkable, though Bethany noted with ironic amusement that her status had changed not because people understood her better, but because she had married a respected man and participated in a dramatic confrontation. People are fickle, Vaughn observed as they danced slowly under lantern light. Don't trust their approval too much. Or their disapproval, she wrote when the dance ended, wise as always, he smiled. Have I told you today how beautiful you are, Mrs. Northcott? The new name sent warmth through her. She shook her head, pretending to count on her fingers. An oversight I must remedy immediately, he declared, pulling her close to whisper in her ear. You are the most beautiful woman I have ever known, inside and out. Every day I thank whatever fortune brought you to Whispering Pines, even through such difficult circumstances. Later, when the guests had departed and they were finally alone, Vaughn carried Bethany across the threshold of the main house, now truly their home together. Their coming together as husband and wife was tender and passionate, a physical expression of the deep understanding they had built over months of communication that transcended conventional speech. Afterward, as they lay contentedly in each other's arms, Bethany traced letters on Vaughn's chest with her finger. I love you. I love you too, he replied, catching her hand and kissing it. More than I can say, which seems appropriate given our circumstances. His expression grew more serious. I want you to know that I never pity your silence. Sometimes I even envy it the way you observe, the way you communicate so precisely because you must choose each written word with care. I used to hate it, she wrote on her notepad. Now I see it differently. It brought me to you. It did, he agreed. Though I believe we would have found each other somehow in any circumstances. 5 years later, Bethany stood on the porch of North Star Ranch, watching her husband teach their 3-year-old son, Thomas, to ride his first pony. Their daughter, 1-year-old Clara, balanced on Bethany's hip, clapping delightedly at her brother's accomplishment. The ranch had prospered since Blackwell's defeat. Vaughn had expanded their holdings, purchased better breeding stock, and built a reputation for fair dealing throughout the territory. Bethany had transformed the main house into a true home, filled with books, music, and artwork collected on their occasional trips to Denver. Mama, look. Thomas called, waving excitedly as he guided his pony in a small circle. Bethany smiled and waved back. Both children had learned early that their mother communicated differently, and it seemed perfectly natural to them. Thomas was already learning to read specifically, so he could understand her written words. Vaughn lifted Thomas from the pony and carried him toward the house. the boy chattering excitedly about his riding prowess. As they approached, Vaughn's eyes met Bethany's, filled with the same love and understanding that had drawn them together. "I was just telling Thomas about how brave his mother is," Vaughn said, setting the boy down, "how she rode into battle to save his father." Thomas looked up at Bethany with wide eyes. "Papa says you yelled to warn him, even though it hurt." Bethany nodded, handing Clara to Vaughn so she could write. "Sometimes love speaks louder than words." Vaughn read the note aloud for Thomas, then added, "That's exactly right. Your mother doesn't need words to be heard. She speaks through her actions, her kindness, her courage." Thomas considered this solemnly, then asked, "Like how she makes your favorite pie when you're sad, even though you don't tell her you're sad?" Vaughn laughed. "Precisely like that. Your mother hears what most people miss." Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Bethany and Vaughn sat on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. His arm rested comfortably around her shoulders, her head against his chest. "I received a letter from the governor today," Vaughn mentioned. "He's appointed me to the Territorial Water Commission. It would mean occasional trips to Cheyenne." Bethany wrote, "You should accept. You understand water rights better than most." "I'd want you with me," he said. "Both of us representing North Star." She looked at him questioningly. "The governor specifically mentioned your perspective would be valuable," Vaughn explained. "Your reputation for fair judgment has spread. The incident with the Matthews family last year impressed many people." Bethany had mediated a land dispute between neighbors when tension threatened to escalate into violence. Her written communications had clarified misunderstandings and led to a peaceful resolution. "I would be proud to join you," she wrote, "the children. Mrs. Kavanaugh would be delighted to spoil them for a few days," Vaughn smiled. "Besides, they should see more of the territory. It's their heritage." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching shooting stars trace bright paths across the darkness. "5 years ago today," Vaughn said eventually, "I asked you to marry me. I told you then that I heard you more clearly than anyone. That's still true, but now I understand even better what I meant." Bethany looked up at him, curious. "You communicate with such precision, such honesty," he continued. "There's no careless speech, no wasted words. Everything you express matters." He kissed her forehead gently. "In a world of meaningless chatter, your silence taught me to listen for what truly matters." Bethany took out her notepad, writing by the light of the moon. "And you taught me that being heard has nothing to do with making noise. Love doesn't need sound to be understood." "No," Vaughn agreed, drawing her closer. "The loudest voices are often the emptiest. But yours, unspoken as it is, resonates through everything you touch, our home, our children, my heart." She turned in his arms, her eyes conveying everything words could not. As their lips met under the vast Wyoming sky, Bethany knew with absolute certainty that she had found her voice not in speech, but in being truly heard by the man who loved her beyond words. The silence between them was filled with a language all their own, created through years of understanding, forged in challenge, and sustained by love that needed no sound to be perfectly, completely heard.